Welcome, everybody, to episode 114 of the Inglorious Bastards podcast. With me tonight, I have a very special guest. She is a lecturer in fantasy and children's literature at the University of Glasgow. She is the writer and or editor of many books, including Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, Celtic Myth in Contemporary Children's Fantasy, and most recently, the book that I have just recently purchased, A Secret Vice, Tolkien on Invented Languages. She has won many awards, including the Mythopoeic Scholarship Award and the Tolkien Society's Award for Best Book. She is probably one of the most active and prolific Tolkien scholars. I could go on and on. With me tonight is Dr. Dimitra Fimi. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is kind of an interesting interview for me, not just because you're amazing and I'm excited to have you here, but also because I'm going to be kind of piggybacking on the interview that you did for the Tolkien Experience podcast. Now my podcast is not affiliated with their podcast at all, but it was an excellent interview that you did with them. It was sort of their inaugural, the first episode that they had ever recorded. So I encourage people to go listen to that to get a background for what we're going to talk about. And from there, I guess I'll just start right in. So the question is this: you are a very prolific writer and lecturer, and somehow you've managed to find time to advise a lot of other great Tolkien scholars, such as Luke Sheldon and Andrew Higgins, who is your co-editor on A Secret Vice. So in advising some of these people and being as active as you are, do you find that Tolkien scholarship has changed over time? And if so, like where's the scholarship heading?
Yes, it has changed. Gosh, it has. When I was doing my PhD, people thought I was completely strange and weird, and why was I doing something like this? That who would employ me? That was the worry at the time, because it was just unheard of. Tolkien was, he still is not, I don't suppose, a canonical author in the traditional sort of sense, but he's getting there. The tide has turned in major ways. Advising is one of the biggest pleasures of an academic's job, and I am in a traditional UK sort of academic position where I have teaching and research. And part of my teaching time is teaching undergraduates, postgraduates, etc., like in a weekly basis. We call it supervising over here. I think advising is the American term, but supervising PhDs is a big part of my job, and it's a privilege, and it's brilliant to see, what projects come out of my my PhD students' work. I've got another 5 on the go at the moment, and more lined up for September. So the demand is there, and it's just brilliant to see new ideas sort of flowering, having those creative conversations with people who have started looking at things that you haven't even ever thought about. You think you thought about everything and you haven't. There's always more to do in Tolkien studies. So I think we're definitely looking at new scholarship towards, for example, Tolkien's languages, and that's in many ways how A Secret Vice came up together as a project. So Andy is one of the first people who really looked at the languages in a serious way and in a detailed way, and that was always a bee in my bonnet from my first books. I had a go at really the ideas about philosophy of language in Tolkien's world, but somebody really needed to go, to his early stuff and see how the language and the mythology sort of cross-pollinated each other, and that was Andy's project, and he was the right person to do this. He's working on a book right now, so that's going to be exciting when that comes out. Luke's project was very, very different. So again, that's part of the pleasure of these PhD supervising activities, is that you get to get involved with many different things. Luke's was a sort of reception studies. And it included fieldwork. It included interviewing young readers of The Lord of the Rings and trying to understand the way that younger readers receive the text, and does that really actually tally up with what us, the scholars, as a consensus understand about the text. And in many ways, Luke's project, I think, sort of challenges some of the cliches that all the Tolkien scholarship has fallen into. And that's, again, something very, very exciting. I've got a student who's working with Tolkien's ideas of folklore, and mostly his sort of non-Middle-earth poetry, which is doing some brilliant stuff. I've got another student who's working on Tolkien and the Irish material, the Irish tradition. Again, the Tolkien's Celtic sort of sources is something that I've published on, but there's so much more to be done there. I've got a student who's working on fantasy and theatre and theatricality, and there is a bit of Tolkien in that as well. So there are a number of different things that I don't think my generation would have necessarily been thinking about. You know, it's as the field is expanding and different approaches and different ideas come to they come to inform the field as it grows, then new perspectives come in. And actually all of this illuminates Tolkien's work, or often, you know, as with The Secret Vice, new material comes to the fore. So yeah, it's a great part of the job, the supervising, and it does keep me sort of up to date with the cutting edge of what's happening right now with the younger generation of scholars. And of course, there's always going to be new concerns, I suppose, and new anxieties and new ways of thinking. So I think we're talking a lot more today about diversity in fantasy literature, about gender and ethnicity representation, and we are going back to sort of revisit Tolkien's work in that respect. And again, you know, my work, my first book, which is now 10 years old. Gosh, I don't know when that happened, but there you go. I had a, you know, one of the first sort of analysis of race and racial anthropology in Tolkien's work. But this still needs so much more work. So I've seen some interesting papers that look at Tolkien from a post-colonial perspective, for example, or look at more creative responses to gender diversity, etc.
Wow. Well, let's stay right on the books that you've written, and let's go to your next book. I believe the next one that you published was Celtic Myth in Contemporary Children's Fantasy.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That was the second monograph. It all happened very, so I had the first book was 2008, then A Secret Vice was 2016, and Celtic Myth was 2017. But they were sort of written at this about the same time. I mean, it was a crazy couple of years where I was doing two books at the same time.
Oh my!
Which I have no idea how that sort of, you know. I mean, a lot of Celtic myth in contemporary children's fantasy was written late at nights. I mean, I'm going to be completely honest here. And that, when I submitted it, I was so worried that it would come back with, this doesn't make any sense. This sounds like somebody who's staying up at 2:00 a.m. to sort of write. But I had a very young child at the time, and I was in a different job, which was much more teaching intensive. So there was no, you know, the time I had was far more limited. But that was a fun book to write, and it was in many ways going back to my master's studies, which was I have a master's in Celtic studies, and looking again at the reception of Welsh and Irish medieval literature in contemporary fantasy, which is children's fantasy, especially children and young adult, which has been something I've been fascinated with for a while. But I think what I wanted to try and explain and sort of argue was that there's a particular vision of the Celtic world that fantasy keeps on reproducing that isn't necessarily what scholarship would understand is the authentic Celtic past, or you know, can we even use the term Celtic? You know, that's a big debate at the moment in academia. But there is a sort of there are stereotypes there that fantasy reproduces, but at the same time, it preserves all of this. The creative sort of more magical elements. Have fed into some amazing pieces of children's fantasy, like Lloyd Alexander, Alan Garner, Susan Cooper. You know, some very, very big names.
Well, you know, this has come up a lot in my interviews. Surprisingly, I had no idea when I went down this rabbit hole that Celtic myth would come up so much. And Verlyn Flieger has written pieces on this, and we got a chance to interview her. We talked a little bit about some of the Celtic flooding myths that Tolkien would have been familiar with.
Oh, for sure.
So let's stay on the children's fantasy path. I know that you've talked about, I think I've seen it and listened to it in other interviews and maybe even on social media, where you're reading The Hobbit with your kids.
Oh, with my son. Yeah, I've got a young boy, and we read it, finished reading it around November last year. So it was from September to November-ish. So it took us a couple of months. and he was then just, he's 7. He turned 7 in January, so he was just leading up to 7 years old, and it was so much fun. It was so much fun. And we just did it at bedtime reading, as you do with all sorts of, we had done already like Winnie the Pooh and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and a lot of classics. And then I thought, right, I think this is now the right time. And for a Tolkien scholar, it's really difficult. I've tried not to sort of overwhelm him with Tolkien all the way through, because that's a big temptation, and you can have the opposite effect.
Yeah.
That way. But reading it with him was it was sort of a revelation in some ways, because I sort of revisited with the eyes of a nearly 7-year-old.
Well, what's funny to me, I'm reading it with. Actually, I had just finished reading The Hobbit with my 8-year-old daughter, and what's funny to me is into Tolkien as I am, and in fact, I've been podcasting now for a year and a half about the subject. It hadn't occurred to me. I guess maybe I didn't think, or maybe I'm just good at sort of separating my life. Like I do this over here and this over here. But it wasn't until I read. There's a science fiction book called Red Rising, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the author in the acknowledgement talks about how formative it was for him when his father read The Hobbit to him, and I thought, wow, that's genius. and so I did, and it was really she's so into it. She wants a Hobbit themed birthday party.
Of course.
And so the reason I bring this up, I guess, what is it about The Hobbit that makes it such a fun book to read to kids? What do you think?
Well, it was first told aloud to kids. It was that is its origin. Its origin is very much oral. And at the same time, although I know Tolkien himself came to regret the sort of authorial voice and the asides and all of this, it trusts the young reader. There's no there's no portal. You open the book and you're straight away into another place, into another world, and that nobody had quite done that in the same way until Tolkien did it for young readers. And that trust of, I'm going to take you in that other world, and we will navigate it. And with Bilbo, you're going to find out more about Middle Earth, and you'll find out about a number of things, some of them pretty complex, some of them very, very scholarly, but in a way that makes sense, and in a story that is quite exciting. But at the same time, there's no sort of dumbing down or sort of less demanding in terms of descriptions, for example. There's pages and pages of description, and that trust that the young reader is going to follow with that and feel that they are not being patronized, but they're being spoken to as readers that are worth addressing. Is quite important. I also think there's it's just hilarious at points. There's so much humor in The Hobbit that, again, I don't think it comes across as much if you don't read it aloud. When you read it aloud, a lot of wordplay, repetition, all of the Burra Hobbit scene, when Bilbo is with the trolls. I mean, we had hysterics of laughter with that one. I was like, it really didn't make me laugh on the page. It's very, very different when you read these things aloud. Or, the dialogue between Thorin and the Elven King in Mirkwood, which is like, so what were you doing here? We were starving, and you were trying to sort of spy on my people. No, we were just starving. He keeps on saying we were starving, and if you read it aloud, you read it as if it's been written in capitals, and you suddenly realize the humor of the scene where Thorin's just saying, we just needed food. We have nothing against you. We just needed to eat something, and it's just very, very funny.
And it's really it's a joy to read out loud. I think it was Michael Drought who said it's really clear who's talking in The Hobbit, whereas there's some books that it's a little harder to read them out loud.
Yes, but orality was its inception. This is a story that was told orally for a long time before committed to paper. It was committed to paper in bits. It was not. This isn't something that was composed from the beginning on paper, and that, I think, shows quite clearly.
Yeah. Well, as a parent to a child who's probably about the same age as my kids, can I tell you a dad joke? We'll see if you can appreciate this.
Yeah, go for it.
So today my wife was watching a one of those shows about building houses, and they were talking about sort of refinishing this fireplace, and they were talking about brick and mortar. And my son says, "Mommy, what's mortar?" And I'm in the kitchen without a beat. I said, "It's where Sauron lives." And and my and my daughter just goes, "Daddy." It's her way of rolling eyes at me.
Oh
So,
goodness, that's great. That's
uh,
excellent. I had some sort of unforeseen reactions to the Hobbit as well, I suppose, because it was just that we'd finished it, and my son was sort of, still talking about it and doing drawings. He did quite a bit of fan art around the Hobbit, and then
mm,
he was talking to his daddy and my husband, and he was saying, "You know what, Daddy? At the end, Thorin dies," and he was quite, he was quite sad about it. And me, as a sort of protective mum, sort of jumped in straight away, and said, "Yeah, but at least, he got to say goodbye to Bilbo, and it wasn't that bad." And he's like, "Well, the main thing is he did the right thing in the end, and he said sorry."
aw,
He said sorry. It's like, you see, there you go. Some of the main message is there, right? The
that's right.
redemption of Thorin is quite an
That's right.
important part of the story.
They all became better in the end, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's very good. We could probably talk about this for a really long time and our kids.
definitely.
But I just recently picked up A Secret Vice, Tolkien on Invented Languages, which you edited with Andrew Higgins. One of the things that I thought the listener would find sort of most interesting was how this book came to be, and how you organized the book. Is that something
Mm.
you could talk to us about?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, the talk, a hobby for the home was the initial title. Then later on, Tolkien referred to as a secret vice. It's sitting in a box in the Bodleian. It's been sitting in the box in the Bodleian for a long, long time, and we know that that's the version that Christopher Tolkien used in the Monsters and the Critics and other essays. And I had looked into that box when I was doing my PhD, and that's going back a long time ago now, far too long. Um, and I knew that it wasn't just the talk in there. There was a mini essay just before the main essay, which was all about a weird phenomenon called phonetic symbolism, which is a very heretic idea. It's very anti-Saussurian, sort of anti-mainstream linguistics at the time. It sort of argues that there is an intrinsic connection between the sound of something and its meaning, which is completely the opposite of what modern linguistics say, which is meaning and sound are arbitrary. The relationship between meaning and sound are arbitrary. We call a table because we've decided that's what we're going to call it. There's nothing tabley about a table, if you see what I mean. But sound symbolism sort of says that there might be something tabley about a table. And I'm oversimplifying here, clearly.
Well,
But
you
that is.
actually sounded quite a lot like Bilbo. This
You
is-
think?
yeah.
Oh,
Go
well,
ahead.
anyway, so that was always interesting to me because I always thought that Tolkien was hinting at this phenomenon in a number of his linguistic work, actually, and in Middle Earth in certain points. So back then, I had asked the Tolkien estate to reproduce that mini essay in my book, in Tolkien, Race and Cultural History. I do reference it back then. But they said, look, this is just a whole essay that's never been published before, and this isn't the right place for it. I thought, that's fine, that's okay, that's it's their decision, and you respect it. And then Andy started his PhD with me, and of course went back to look at A Secret Vice because it's such a key text in terms of Tolkien's invented languages. And while turning the pages, he sort of suddenly we were together in the Bodleian, we were there because I was just looking at another box at that particular point, and he turns around and says, "Dimitra, there's a couple of pages here. What is this?" There's pages here of the essay that are not in Christopher's edition.
Oh.
There were a couple of loose pages of very, very, very bad handwriting. I have to be completely honest here. And in pencil as well, which is a nightmare with the old sort of frail paper and all that. And it was clearly a bit that there was a little arrow where Tolkien was meant to insert that into the main essay, so it had a place in the main essay, but was never included. And part of me is thinking it's because it was nearly unreadable. It took a long time to transcribe. So Andy referenced that and used that in his thesis because it introduced a whole new invented language, Norwegian, which wasn't known or heard of until that point.
Wow.
So Andy was towards the end of finishing his PhD. We've been talking about this. I was like, look, there is a lot in that box that people haven't seen. There is all of that essay on phonetic symbolism, which I think is absolutely crucial and needs to get out there. There is all of this extra stuff in A Secret Vice. And then there were all the notes after the talk. And there again, there were some sort of random things, but clearly also some notes related to the talk about some very, very interesting figures of around the time that Tolkien gave the talk, which you would never, ever think that Tolkien would have anything to do with. And we're talking about modernists like James Joyce and Gertrude Stein. And I remember
Mhm.
sort of Andy and I rubbing our eyes, is this really Stein's name there? Are we just imagining this? How can that be? So that's when we sort of sat down and thought, right, this is just, we really need to go to the estate and make a case that this talk sits around a number of other things that are related, they're clearly all related, they're all about contemporary, and they're worth other people's while to see. They're important for Tolkien scholarship. They're important for the context, the cultural context in which he was creating his languages. Maybe they're not as weird as people think. There is a whole historical cultural context. So yeah, that led them to a proposal to the estate. The estate first approved that, and then we went to HarperCollins with a further proposal, and things just things rolled from there.
Wow, that's a big deal.
I suppose I had already a sort of a relationship with the estate in the sense that I had already got permission to use bits and pieces in my book. So my first book already had some stuff, like snippets of unpublished stuff from Tolkien, but not whole big, not whole piece of work. But I suppose there was a trust there already that I wouldn't go and do anything silly with the material, and that I would respect the material, and that I would present it in the way that it is, and not sort of try to appropriate it in any way. So it wasn't completely a beginning of a relationship from scratch, but yes, it was a huge step, that to sort of take on a whole edition with one of my students whom they didn't know Andy yet at that point. So it was a huge thing, actually. And I still can't believe that it happened, to be honest with you. There are points where I still wake up and I think this was just a dream, right? It can't have happened.
It's a dream. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it probably took years to sort of build that trust. And if I could ask you, obviously you've had a huge impact on a lot of people, both just fans and other people studying with you and sort of reading your work and listening to you. But I'm curious about you. Has there been one particular teacher or scholar that was really formative for you?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think there were two major people while I was, I suppose, training to do what I am doing now, and that's during my master's and PhD days. And one was my own PhD supervisor. I was very, very lucky to have an amazing supervisor. It's Professor John Hines, who's still a professor at Cardiff University, who is at the moment a professor of archaeology, but for a long time he also worked as a philologist. He actually was taught the same curriculum that Tolkien had devised, and he was, I think he just missed Tolkien in Oxford by like a couple of years or something. So we're talking about that sort of generation. And he'd known Tom Shippey for a long, long time before. All the, there are, how many Anglo-Saxonists are there? Or were there at that time? There's many, many more today, I suppose. But John was brilliant, and first of all took a chance, with a PhD that was just, strange, as I said, and weird, and he understood Tolkien's own professional life, I suppose, and that was a huge part of his guidance to me, was getting me to understand the sort of scholarly environment that he worked in and the sort of stuff that he knew. The other person is Dr. Juliet Wood, who was my tutor in my master's in Celtic studies, and I've later on I taught with her. We're sort of working on a piece of work at the moment together. But she was a president of the Folklore Society for many years. She's been very influential as a folklorist and as a writer on Celtic stuff, but also all sorts of other traditions. And I suppose I got my background in folklore and anthropology from Juliet, and I can't think of a better mentor and a better scholar to look up to. Really, I was very lucky with my tutors.
That's great. Well, while we're on sort of most influential, we're going to kind of shift to some favorites. Now, I've watched a lot of interviews that you've done from the BBC to the Discovery Channel. I think I even saw one with John Rhys Davies. Is that right?
Yeah, that was 2 years ago. Yep.
Well, can you tell me? Do you have one of those like favorite interview moments?
So I've done quite a lot of work for while I was in Wales before my new job in Glasgow, quite a lot of work for BBC Radio Wales, and that was brilliant. That was I did quite regularly newspaper reviews for them as well, but also I was in as a guest speaker whenever there was anything about Tolkien or fantasy or whatever, and. There was never a one steady person. It was always a rotation of speakers. But the people at BBC Radio Wales taught me a lot about how to do, I suppose, public engagement and how to get ideas across really clearly and succinctly and quickly and live. There was no sort of recording most of those times. I suppose in terms of interviews that were memorable, that one with John Rhys Davies was quite amazing in the sense that it was a video one, and I'll be completely honest with you, I prefer the radio. There's a lot of faffing around when there's cameras involved. There's a lot of sort of makeup and things that I don't like very much, and sort of waiting around. My goodness, the waiting around you have to do for a 5-minute clip. It just defeats me. I just after a while I lose the will to live. But while we were waiting, John Rhys Davies, I was quite impressed with how knowledgeable he was about, for example, English literature. We talked a lot about Yeats, we talked a lot about Kipling, we talked a lot about sort of science fiction. And then when we ended up being in front of the camera and doing the actual interview, he ended up directing me. So, I don't know how he did it, but we ended up not looking at each other, because we had to look at the camera in a particular way. But when you watched it, it was as if we were looking at each other. And I have no idea how directors do these things, but they do. And it was quite an experience that I still can't explain to you how it happened. But it did.
So you have a lot of these on your website, I believe. So if people want to go see, is this interview on your website?
I don't know if it is anymore. It used to be on BBC I Wonder. I'm not sure whether that is still there. But there's quite a few of my radio stuff and the History Channel one for Turkish TV. There's quite a few things on the website.
Great. Okay, well, I want to ask you. This is kind of a personal, not a personal question for you, more of a personal question for me. So I'm getting ready to take a Tolkien pilgrimage of sorts to England, which I'm going to podcast, and these will be sort of recorded, and there'll be video, and I'm getting tours from professional tour guides, and getting to meet with some people from the Tolkien Society. It's going to be great.
Excellent.
But I have a question. In interviewing, I just interviewed Ted Naismith, and he had some sort of nuggets of wisdom from his time in England, things that I wouldn't have guessed. Like, so I'm gonna hit the big spots, right? I'm gonna go to Oxford, I'm gonna go up to Birmingham, and hit up Stafford. But he mentioned one place in particular called the Bell Inn, which might have been the inspiration for the Prancing Pony, he says. So I'm curious, as someone who lives is sort of near the area, and someone who's sort of traveled around England, and I'm sure seen the sights. Are there any hidden gems that you can give to me of places I should go?
There is one place you definitely need to go to. I wouldn't say it's a hidden one, but it's one that people forget about, and I don't know why. It's one of the very few places that actually Tolkien himself identified as a direct influence for a particular scene in The Lord of the Rings, and I don't know why. I don't hear more Tolkien sort of visitors, going there, and that's Cheddar Gorge and Caves. And then this is, the glittering caves of Aglarond, the caves behind Helm's Deep. And we know he went there a few times. He went there on honeymoon first with Edith. He went later on, and I recently went because I'm just working on a poster presentation for a scientific conference with Dr. Kristin Larsen on geology, and as an inspiration for Tolkien. We're looking at Cheddar Caves specifically, and it was just you walked in and you could literally sort of every few sort of chambers of because it is a multi-chamber cave. It goes in for a while, and you walk around it, and you come back, and it's not just a small place, but in every chamber you go, you find another little bit, and you're like, oh, that comes up in Gimli's speech. Oh, that. It is point for point, really following the route of Gauss Gauge, which is the main biggest cage in the complex. So I did a blog post about it, and I posted some of my photos and a video of the Aladdin's cave, which is the most beautiful part of the cave. And as I said, there is this poster presentation for a geology conference that's coming up between me and Christine. But people need to go and see it. It's a real place. He walked there and he used this particular location very, very specifically.
Well, you'll be very happy to know that that is on my list of things
Oh,
to
there
do
you
while
go.
I'm there.
Perfect. I'm very
I'm
happy.
planning to spend a whole day there. Well, so one of the last questions I have to ask you is about kind of related to our podcast. Now, in our podcast, we're in part 3 of kind of a storyline that has taken us to the Lonely Isle, and now to Aman, and they're kind of going all over the place, meeting these people that we've read about in the Book of Lost Tales or in the Silmarillion, and in some ways, sort of moving forward in time through my podcast. I'm actually kind of moving back in time in Tolkien's writings in some ways, and they're about to meet some characters named Aryan and Tilion.
Yep.
And so I'm curious. I wanted to ask you about, in the podcast I referred to it as the Lay of Narsilion, but I think that's like it's redundant. I think just saying Narsilion sort of implies the lay. Is that right?
It does, yes, yes. I mean, Narsilion is one of those very tantalizing references because it clearly refers to what Tolkien had envisioned as a big piece of work, a lay or a long narrative poem that told the story of how the sun and the moon were created by the Valar. But it doesn't seem like he ever wrote it. Or if he does, I mean, Christopher Tolkien says in the Shaping of Middle-earth, if he ever did, I've never seen it. So it might be that, there is some hidden sort of piece of paper with it somewhere. But I don't think so. I think this is one of those classic cases of a sort of a referenced epic that adds depth to the world but isn't necessarily there. Or maybe there were plans to write it and he never did. And it actually shows once more how Tolkien is using folkloric and mythological tropes and structures in his own writing, because when you read primary world mythologies, real world mythologies, there's always references to long pieces of work that we very often have lost. And there is always this sort of sense of a palimpsest of layers of texts that talk back to each other. Some of them oral, some of them written. And I think that's what's happening here. We have a text that was, that could have been written if Tolkien had decided to, or may have been written, we just don't know, but which encapsulates in the oral tradition inside his world one of the most important parts of sort of, the cosmogony, really, the creation of the world as the elves and men later on come to know it. I think the whole myth of the creation of the sun and the moon in Tolkien is quite interesting because it's different to most other primary world mythologies in the sense that the sun and the moon are not the... if you think about how many sort of mythologies have the sun as a major deity, for example, or how many scholars are thinking about mythological traditions as sun worshipping, etc. In Tolkien's mythology, the sun and the moon are the second best thing. They're not the main sort of way of illuminating the earth. These were the trees, and the trees were destroyed, and we're left now with this leftover. The sun and the moon are what's left of something that was much more splendid, much more magical, much more enchanting. So this sense of loss is already embedded in this creation of the sun and the moon. And I think if that lay existed, or if it does exist, it would be a sort of elegiac, slightly melancholy piece of work.
Sure. And this must have been mentioned in the Book of Lost Tales. Is that right?
The song isn't mentioned. No, actually the Book of Lost Tales, the tale of the creation of the sun and the moon is very, very long. It goes on and on and on. Christopher Tolkien actually says that he only gives us parts of it. It's just far too long to include all of it, and that he summarized, at certain points. And he seems to have really got into the nitty-gritty of how the gods and the he calls them gods at that point, the Valar, how gods and the Maya think, how they mourn, how they cry, how they make things with their hands. It's a very tactile story, the early one, which we don't see much of that at all in the Silmarillion. It all happens in a few pages, and it's much more sort of elevated biblical sort of rough around the edges sort of description. We don't get all of this down to earth, hands on creation that we get in the Book of Lost Tales. I think something sort of got lost a bit there, but of course it fits with the effect of the Silmarillion as it came to be later on.
And these are the things that I think make these stories so rich and make people just want more, right? The sort of offhanded comments about Queen Beruthiel, or like, what about the Entwives? Like,
exactly.
tell us more, please.
All the bits that we don't have. I mean, but that's, again, this is somebody who was a medievalist, right? This is, and I say that to my students very often, being a medievalist is absolutely brilliant, but it's also frustrating. It's so frustrating because there's all of these references to all of these stories, that all these texts that we just not have. I mean, it's the same with being a classicist or studying any of the ancient cultures. There's always references to stories and texts that we just don't have anymore. And for Tolkien, that was a source of inspiration. It was like, okay, that story doesn't exist. We've got some hints. How can I fill the gap? And how can I, in some ways, that's the Hobbit sort of plot coming out of the Voluspa. The sort of, okay, there's all of these references to dwarfs and an elf with a staff and a thief. What is that story all about? And there we go.
And probably, as frustrating as it is, you have those moments like you did at the Bodleian where you find these pieces of paper and it's like being an archaeologist, right? Like,
and it still happens, I suppose. There's still manuscripts, might still get discovered, and some of these stories sometimes surface again. You never know. That's part of the allurement, I suppose, of the field as well.
Yeah. Well, I've kept you for about 40 minutes, so I'd like to just end the interview just asking you about anything that you have coming up here. I know you mentioned there's a course that you're offering this summer that I wanted to just, if you wanted to plug.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm working on setting everything up at the moment. That's going to be a lot of fun. It's a new summer course at the University of Glasgow, which is going to give a bit of a glimpse of what we do, because we have a whole master's in fantasy in Glasgow. We've got about 30 students working on PhDs in fantasy. There are events, there are sort of public engagement things, there is funding for projects, all of these things. But this is going to be a bit of a flavour, and it's an accredited summer course, so people can come and do it for credit and use it for their university degree wherever in the world they are. It's going to be called Fantastic Texts and Where to Find Them.
Oh, that's great.
I know. I was thinking I had to find a title that I liked to sort of repeat to myself, and it's. I think Glasgow is a lovely place to do this sort of thing. And one of the mascots of, well, it's not really a mascot. One of the symbols of the university is the unicorn, which is also a Scottish symbol as well. So it feels sort of like the right place. So we will do some Scottish fantasy as well. Peter Pan is one of the main texts we'll look at, and we'll go to the to Dumfries, to the place where J.M. Barrie went to school and grew up, and the garden he played that he later on acknowledged as an inspiration for Neverland. We'll definitely do some Harry Potter because Hogwarts is around the corner from where we are, I think. And we will go up to Glenfinnan Viaduct and see, where they shot the Hogwarts Express going past the viaduct. But of course there will be Tolkien. And of course there will be Le Guin. There will be some major key fantasy authors included, but also some of the theories and critical approaches to fantasy.
Well, I'm a little jealous of anyone who gets to take this course. That sounds fantastic. Anything else that you want to mention that you have coming up that you're excited about?
Oh, there's a number of articles in the pipeline at the moment. There's something on Tolkien and Kipling I've been working on for far too long that I need to get out. I was talking to Luke Shelton about that as well. And this is just my reminder to myself to get that thing done and out of the way. And I suppose after that, there's far too many possibilities. I have to wait and see, what flowers first. That's the problem at the moment, is that I've got too many ideas, and I'm just going to see what will pan out naturally in the next couple of years.
Well, as a fan community, we look forward to any of those. So thank you, Dr. Fimi, for coming with us.
Thank you very much for having me.